Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tsepo Modiba and thanks for joining me. Tonight I'm joined by Ayalanesh Tafese, country risk analyst at Rand Merchant Bank, for a closer look at the relationship between India and Africa. Ayalanesh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This is an interesting subject. Naturally, when we're talking investment opportunities, the big country that we speak about is China. Right, and the relationship between China and the continent. How does the India relationship differ from that?
I think India is very aware of China's presence in Africa.
Right.
And they very, very strongly try to position themselves as Africa's development partner.
Right.
So what you'll tend to find is a lot of the Indian investment is geared towards that. So it'll be a lot of things in healthcare, a lot of things in skills transfer into things like manufacturing and IT, even things such as the Indian Navy being present around Mozambique to help with piracy activities.
Right.
While India positions itself as the development partner, it also has a very strong business leaning.
Right.
The Indian Navy does help Mozambique out because of possible gas that India plans on using in future. So development, but with a strong economic benefit at the end of the day for both sides.
So does that mean, I guess, in the scale of the relationship, Africa benefits a little bit more?
I would say it's pretty equal at this point. I think both economies are going into it with eyes wide open.
Right.
If you look at something simple like trade, I think trade has really been an area where we've seen India-Africa relations blossoming. About a decade ago, there wasn't a lot of trade between the two. And that number has actually increased sevenfold in the decade since then. And that has really been driven by during the global financial crisis, both India and Africa realized just how dependent they were on North America and Europe.
Yep.
They needed to find new areas for export destinations as a result of that. And India was in a place where they have strong manufacturing capabilities. They need to sell their manufactured goods. Africa needs those goods. On the other hand, India is also a fast developing nation.
Right.
And their need for natural resources, oil, their need for energy security is quite great. And that's where Africa plays a hand. When you look at it, crude oil exports from Africa to India were pretty much non-existent in 2005.
Right.
Africa now accounts for a fifth of India's energy imports. So each has a side to gain, and it's been something that has been negotiated over the last few decades.
And the big beneficiary from that trade in terms of oil, I'm assuming, is Nigeria?
Exactly. Your big names, Nigeria and Angola, are a big source of oil. India is actually Nigeria's main export destination for oil,
Right.
now that the US has become more and more self-reliant on these fronts.
Right.
But what's really interesting on that front is Reliance Industries is an Indian company which runs one of the biggest refineries in India.
Yep.
And to give you this, an idea of the size, they have the capability to refine around 1.2 million barrels of oil per day.
Right.
Nigeria last quarter produced 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. So
Right.
Reliance Industries by itself could possibly has the capability to refine Nigeria's oil.
Right.
What's really interesting is once this oil goes from Nigeria to India, it's not necessarily consumed in India.
Right.
It finds its way back to Africa, where countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique are actually big importers of refined oil from India. So it's actually quite a tight relationship that's between the two nations.
And this, I'm assuming, is there scope for this relationship specifically around commodities to grow further?
Absolutely. I think India going forward really wants to position itself as an international manufacturing hub.
Right.
And not only are we probably going to see situations where Indian manufacturing or Indian demand for raw materials grows, but what we have seen over the last year at least, is a lot of foreign companies relocating their manufacturing bases to India.
Right.
So Korean companies and that sort of thing. And again, that increases the scope for foreign companies to start sourcing raw materials in Africa to then go back to India. So not only will the India-Africa relationship be confined to India and Africa, but as India's prominence grows, you'll find the rest of the world looking to India, and Africa as a result increasing its exports of natural resources.
Now, is the trade between the continent and India largely constrained to raw materials and commodities, or is this relationship broader than that?
So what we typically find is from the African side into India, it's pretty much raw materials and commodities.
Right.
Where we have seen a different tune is in East Africa. Okay. East Africa has traditionally been India's gateway into Africa for historical reasons.
Right.
But for example, for a country like Ethiopia, which doesn't have a lot of natural resources to export, the government of that country is really focusing on industrialization.
Right.
What they've done over the past few years is they've built economic zones or industrial zones outside of the capital cities. These are actually fully fledged manufacturing houses or manufacturing factories that they've built, and they will then give this to companies who want to relocate manufacturing into Ethiopia. What is really interesting is over the last few years, the biggest take-up of this has come from India, Turkey, and China.
Right.
So a lot of Indian companies are moving their manufacturing bases, strangely enough, to Ethiopia. Ethiopia benefits in the sense that a lot of the manufacturing and agro-processing in textiles is very labor-intensive.
Right.
So from an employment perspective, it's doing quite well. And again, once you've manufactured it here in Ethiopia, you're then able to send it out to the rest of East Africa.
Is there potential that that relationship can go further than Ethiopia into the rest of the continent?
Absolutely. I think in countries like Kenya, for example, a lot of the collaboration between India has really been about skills transfer and export of services from India into East Africa to help with things like technology.
Right.
We know that Kenya is the Silicon Valley of Africa. That's how people describe it.
Yep.
On that front, in countries like Tanzania, we're seeing a lot of input in manufacturing of raw materials such as sugar manufacturing, refining rice to be sent back to India.
Right.
And I think the difference in Tanzania, though, is a lot of those relationships have been built as a result of a large number of Tanzanians of Indian origin existing within Tanzania. So those trade links were naturally there.
Right.
So you tend to find that we are talking about the relationship between a whole continent and a subcontinent.
Yeah.
So the relationship varies very much from country to country.
To be fair, a subcontinent that's massive from a population perspective. Yeah. I guess then, what are the investment implications? And it sounds like a pretty decent theme, given that India is likely to grow quite quickly, trade could potentially increase dramatically going forward. How do you, as an investor on the continent, play this theme? How do you access returns to it?
In a lot of ways. I think what we are seeing now is, as this relationship blossoms, a lot of financial firms involved in trade financing are now becoming aware of the growing need for trade financing between India and Africa.
Right.
A lot of Indian banks are not actually active in Africa,
yes,
and their knowledge of Africa is not as strong as they would like it to be.
Okay.
So for African financiers or African companies involved in trade financing, it does produce a lot of opportunities.
Right.
We've seen the likes of EcoBank and that sort of thing starting to talk to Indian banks and trying to get into some sort of relationship with them. So I think that is definitely one thing to watch. Another thing to look out for is really the fact that Indian companies no longer just want to export from India into Africa.
Right.
A lot of companies, we're seeing a lot of vehicle manufacturers, your Mahindras and your Tatas. We're seeing a lot of pharmaceutical manufacturers like Cipla and Lupin actually increasing their presence within Africa itself, both from a logistics perspective.
Yep.
So from a logistics perspective, that's important to look out for, and even to a certain degree from a manufacturing perspective.
Right.
Traditionally, South Africa was the base
yep,
for a lot of these countries. But if you are now an investor outside of South Africa in countries like Kenya, even Nigeria, you're beginning to see Indian investment flooding into those countries specifically directly, without coming through South Africa necessarily.
So a lot of foreign direct investments going into those hubs. So what are I guess you touched on the financial sector and trade finance in particular. What are the other industries that are likely to benefit from this increase in foreign direct investment?
I think really if you are in a place where you are facilitating import-export, that will continue to be a huge thing to look at going forward.
Right.
I think for a long time this has been an area that has been under focused on, in a sense. Just to give you an idea, for example, you have your vehicle manufacturers like Mahindra and Tata, but outside of that, when you travel to African cities, what you typically see is a lot of motorcycles and rickshaws.
Yep.
You'll see them on the streets of Nigeria, Ghana, wherever you go.
Yep.
A lot of these motorcycles and rickshaws are actually manufactured in India and brought into these countries. Bajaj Auto is one of the big Indian firms that is involved in this. Around 40% of their exports go to Africa. And again, if you are a company involved, for example, in manufacturing parts for this, it makes it easier for the parts to be available in Africa in order to service these cars rather than constantly going back to India to try and source them. Right. So things that'll make importing of products or servicing of already existing Indian products within these countries is definitely industries that I do believe people will be looking at more and more.
If we spend a little bit of time on the commodity side of things and raw materials, which we started on, what should we be looking out for that India will actually need beyond oil?
So outside of oil, a big focus on them right now is gas.
Right.
What was really interesting is when Prime Minister Narendra Modi actually did a 4-country tour of Africa, everybody expected him to start with East Africa, which is a natural ally and a natural business tie to India. Strangely enough, he actually started in Mozambique.
Right.
And that lets you know that gas and ensuring a good supply and secure supply of gas is very important for India.
Right.
If you look at the numbers, India has actually up to now invested around $6 billion in gas fields in Mozambique. We talked about the relation in terms of the Navy, making sure that the area is secure. That's one way of helping Mozambique. But for India, around 90% of their gas comes from Qatar.
Right.
And they really want to diversify away from that. And what makes it really good for countries like Mozambique and Tanzania is the fact that geographically it makes more sense for India to be able to get its gas from there. It'll probably be cheaper. So gas is definitely one of the commodities that they will target going forward.
Right. Industrial metals, is there scope for an increase in trade with India there as India ramps up its growth?
Absolutely, and I think that has been the stronghold of South Africa's relationship with India, has been exports of metals going into India, going into their manufacturing sectors. Another one to look out for is coal, which plays a very big role in India's energy output in terms of electricity within the country. Very slowly, we've also started to see Indian private firms, this is not necessarily government-led, investing a lot of money in Mozambican coal as well. Right. So I think, Mozambique-India is not a natural tie that we've expected to see, but is definitely something that's gaining prominence over the coming years.
Perfect. Let's leave it there. Thanks to my guest, Ayala Tafese, Country Risk Analyst at Rand Merchant Bank. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter, that's @Mudiba_Tsepo, and send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. From myself and the team,